This is a Best in Climate episode of Earth Feels, where each week your hosts Rose and Christine read to you from some of the best climate-related blogs and articles on the web. Today's Best in Climate episode is Today's Progressive Movements Must Learn from Black Lives Matter and Join Together by George Lakey, published on Waging Nonviolence. Hi, I'm Christine. I'm your host for today's episode. In this article, Mr. Lakey discusses how Black Lives Matter prepared for this current moment in key ways, and how the united power of many movements, including that for action on climate change and climate justice, should take on the system. That is really just working for the 1% right now. And although it is a US-based article, it's still applicable to those of us living outside of the United States because, as we know, Black Lives Matter has gone global, as is the struggle for climate justice. Let's get started. As the response to the killing of George Floyd has expanded to all 50 states, it has become a broad social movement, with demonstrations even taking place in small, majority white towns where Trump gained a majority in 2016. As the Washington Post reported, one of those small towns in Ohio hadn't seen a march since the Ku Klux Klan held one 20 years ago. The gratifying news is that the public gets it more than ever before. A new ABC Ipsos poll found that by June 4th, 3/4 of those surveyed believed Floyd's killing not as an isolated incident, but part of a broader problem in the treatment of African Americans by police. This number includes more than a majority, 55%, of Republicans. One of the largest positives of the movement might be the skill with which activists linked police violence to other areas of historic racial injustice in jobs, housing, education, and healthcare. That analysis was echoed in many arenas as people continue to take a deeper look at their own institutional practices and vow to make changes. Even NASCAR has announced it won't let fans wave Confederate flags at races. Unlike one-off protests, which are essentially fleeting expressions of opinion, this movement shows the superior leverage of a direct action campaign. A campaign is a series of nonviolent actions, keeping the heat on, escalating the pressure, and giving time for minds to change and more allies to come on board. Despite the pandemic, people demonstrated in the streets across the country. 2 weeks of actions so changed the landscape that even Republican members of Congress scrambled to find some way to respond. All of today's progressive movements can learn from this movement's persistence in the streets. Continual use of direct action illustrated the point of the demonstrators when police responded with more violence. As in the 1960s civil rights campaigns, this movement's refusal to back away from direct action swelled its ranks because the police in real time gave added fuel. The violence of the military in front of the White House helped as well. Lee Smithy and Lester Kurtz show how this works in their book, The Paradox of Repression and Nonviolent Movements. All of that was supported by the increasing clarity by demonstrators on the importance of nonviolent discipline. That fact enabled the movement to occupy the moral high ground, despite Donald Trump's pathetic wielding of the Bible in front of a church he doesn't go to. Some believe that the widespread impact of the uprising came from the rioting that happened in its first few days. It's too early to form an evidence-based opinion about May's events, but we do have research that gives us insight into the likelihood that rioting helps us make positive change. Omar Wazow, a professor of politics at Princeton who studies protest movements and their effects on politics, examined 137 violent protests following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968. He found that in the counties closest to the riots, the vote in November for Republican Richard Nixon for president increased 6 to 8% over the expected count for those counties. Nixon was running on a law and order platform and won. Another Princeton researcher, Keeanga Yamata Taylor, looked at the 1992 Los Angeles rebellion, which she says was more similar to what we experienced in May than the 1960s riots. As she wrote in the New Yorker, Democrats responded to the 1992 Los Angeles rebellion by pushing the country further down the road of punishment and retribution in its criminal justice system. The Democrats' new emphasis on law and order was coupled with a relentless assault on the right to welfare assistance. Of course, there are Black people who share the widespread belief among whites that violence is the force more powerful. American culture is almost reverential when it comes to belief in violence. But there are also Black people who count the cost to the working class Black community. A week ago, I was the only white person in the room when a circle of working class Black family friends were eating and chatting around my kitchen table. Helicopters were still passing over my house, and police cars blared sirens up my street, responding to rioting and vandalism at the nearby shopping district in West Philadelphia. The conversation burst into emotional condemnation of rioting. They talked indignantly about what the burned-out stores meant to them, jobs lost to people they knew, Black small business owners forced to close, old people with no drugstore left for getting their medicines. They also talked about the increased chance of gentrification as richer white people buy properties and turn them into expensive condos. Why, they wondered, don't Black neighborhoods matter? The events of the last weeks are what Mark and Paul Engler call a whirlwind in their book, This is an Uprising. It can happen at any moment. Movements can make a whirlwind more likely by initiating a direct action campaign, as when Martin Luther King's coalition initiated the Birmingham Civil Rights Campaign of 1964. But we're not really in charge of history. Obviously, the whirlwind can, as in this case, happen without anyone's intention, especially if society is in a period of volatility and polarization like right now. For the groups that have been working for years against racial injustice by police, the challenge becomes reaching out to weave together a network that includes the new leadership now emerging. Activists in the gun control, climate, and other movements may well experience a whirlwind after yet another disaster. When it happens, it helps to be prepared. The most successful social movements I know developed clarity in 3 areas: analysis of the problem, an envisioned big picture solution, and a strategy for getting from here to there. The earlier Black Lives Matter movement prepared for this current whirlwind moment by analyzing the systemic nature of the oppression, seeing violent policing as a symptom as well as a abrasive cause. In 2016, the movement for Black Lives also made a historic break with a vision aversion that had paralyzed activists since the 1980s by publishing a vision, also called its platform. Supplementing that vision is the recent work of the Institute for Policy Studies on behalf of the Poor People's Campaign. Each of the progressive social movements operating in the United States today has the same problem. Its most formidable opponent is the economic elite that, according to the Princeton oligarchy study, runs the country, whichever political party is formally in power. The people fighting for climate justice, peace, gun control, the full freedom of people of color, immigrants, women, and LGBTQ people, economic equality, civil liberties, and educational opportunity all find their most effective and far-reaching proposals blocked by the same source. It is difficult for the leaders of those movements to ally on a national level at this time. They compete for attention, funding, support from Democrats, and so on. Most movements work within their own silos, creating a highly convenient situation for the oligarchy that maintains its dominance by divide and rule. Additionally, the American culture of competition energizes the belief that my issue is the most important. To offset that advantage held by the economic elite, we need a cultural advantage of our own, a vision broad enough to show how the values of each of these progressive movements will be expressed in a new society. In the countries that have taken major strides in racial justice, equality, climate adaptation, democracy, and individual freedom, movement leaders found that, indeed, the oppressions that marked their times were intersectional. They created a vision that drew disparate movements into coalition. I tell their story in my book, Viking Economics. They found their envisioned structures were synergistic. The new policies interacted in ways that made the whole greater than the sum of its parts. Although these countries are not utopias, they took a giant step towards King's vision of a beloved community. That giant step is what's needed next. The initiative of the movement for Black lives needs to be picked up by others. The vision can be enlarged to advance key goals of each of the progressive movements operating today. Together, we can come far closer to the goals of each than we can separately, because the united power of many can overcome the resistance of the 1%. A coalition of movements that joins a future whirlwind moment to win the struggle can at last make racial justice a reality. You just listened to the post titled, "Today's Progressive Movements Must Learn from Black Lives Matter and Join Together," by George Lakey. Mr. Lakey has been active in direct action campaigns for over 6 decades. He recently retired from Swarthmore College and was first arrested in the civil rights movement and most recently in the climate justice movement. He has facilitated 1,500 workshops on 5 continents and led activist projects on local, national, and international levels. His 10 books and many articles reflect his social research into change on community and societal levels. His newest books are Viking Economics, How the Scandinavians Got It Right and How We Can Too, published in 2016, and How We Win, A Guide to Nonviolent Direct Action Campaigning, published in 2018. This article was originally published on Waging Nonviolence.
That's this week's episode of Earth Feels. Special thanks to singer-songwriter Kristen Hoffman for generously allowing us to use Song for the Ocean. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Children of the earth, I'm calling out. There's a mission for you and for me.